All right, welcome into this week at Surviving Paradise, the little podcast that takes a sometimes serious, oftentimes humorous and sarcastic look at the claim by Jehovah's Witnesses that they are living in a modern day spiritual paradise. Welcome in. I am your host of this little show, Stacy Bauman, former elder, ministerial servant, and most importantly, a kid who was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses throughout the 1970s and 1980s. As I do, I always issue a warning because any journey through, whether you're still in or you are out of Jehovah's Witnesses, lots of emotions. There could be some things that trigger you. We try to heal, we try to laugh, lots of sarcasm, humor, and my own unique perspective, experiences, and observations in my time as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But please note, it is never meant to offend. So again, welcome in, whoever and whatever status you may be on this issue regarding Jehovah's Witnesses. Welcome into paradise this week. I couldn't be more excited to continue a little series, a little subset, a little installment I'm calling Story Time with the King. And we started last week. We went a little deep on the Good Samaritan. This week's deep dive story from the King himself has always been one of my favorites. And in my humble opinion, it truly raises some massive, serious questions as we continue to use the book Jehovah's Witnesses claim and hold up as the basis for everything that they do in life. To take a look at what Jesus teaches in its pages against what he is teaching his current board of directors in upstate New York. Therefore, the purpose of this little show and examination. But this story in particular is a big one in my mind. And as I noted, I chose 3 stories, this one being our second in this little installment, because they were 3 that had a big impact on how I personally tried to shape my own personality as a Jehovah's Witness, and most especially so as an elder. And it's my humble belief that these 3 stories expose how deep and how devastating the cognitive dissonance runs in Jehovah's Witnesses in 2023. So again, this story among the 3 is no different. I shared last week that even I, oftentimes on a few occasions while conducting the Watchtower study, in the case of last week on the Good Samaritan story, would have these lucid moments on stage where I wondered how we could read these stories, have entire Watchtower studies on them, and even have dramas, dramatic dramas for the old timers that remember full-blown costume dramas that we all looked forward to as they marched out of the tunnel and near the stage. We would have dramas at the district convention on subjects such as the one we're about to dive into, and we would still completely miss the point of the entire story. And I would marvel at this as an elder, oftentimes right on stage as the paragraph was being read, how it is that 100 or so, or more, even more people in a congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses could be hearing this information, could be reading this information, could be watching this information, and be missing the entire point. And that really exposes the level of cognitive dissonance among Jehovah's Witnesses today. So like our first parable from the pages of the New World Translation, this parable burns the governing body's current teachings on family, on sin, on discipline, and more completely to the ground. There is simply no way to justify current procedures, conduct, attitude, spirit, any of it from the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses when you compare it to the story we're about to dive into. It literally puts everything they do surrounding judicial meetings, disfellowshipping, shunning, and simply on a spiritual level, how we might view each other, all in direct conflict with the guy they claim runs the show from heaven and only has eyes for them. Cue the mental confusion in innocent Jehovah's Witness publishers. Like the story last week, This one proves the level of cognitive dissonance and how deep it goes. They will read this story, they'll listen to this talk, they'll go to a meeting, they'll watch a drama, that and the meeting then ends, and we've all seen this if you've been one of Jehovah's Witnesses for any amount of time. It ends with a silent moment where you can hear pins dropping, and what follows is a 10-second, not even that announcement. I've done many of them myself, that is utterly devastating to a singular person or maybe more in the audience. It's a disfellowshipping announcement. And the witnesses sitting in the audience never connect the dots. Minutes removed from possibly reading the story we're about to dive into. Once you're out of Jehovah's Witnesses and free of all the mental quicksand, you see it plain as day. But it is one of the strangest things that I continue to explore even 14 years out, in how we can read a story like this and at the end of the same meeting get an announcement that completely flies in the face of the story we just considered at the meeting. It is absolutely bizarre. And it transcends Jehovah's Witnesses, in my opinion. It goes to a much deeper psychological, mental, and spiritual issue with cults and how they control people. So what exactly does the king of Jehovah's Witnesses say he wants, he desires from his reps here on the earth? I say let him answer himself. We go right to the New World Translation to kick this off at Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13, where the king, Jesus Christ, and current chairman of the board of Jehovah's Witnesses in upstate New York, says this, quote, "Go then and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. For I came to call not righteous people, but sinners." End quote. Wow. We get the mission statement from the king himself. I want mercy. I don't want sacrifice. I don't need publishing empires or service slips or 90 hours a month. Throw it all in the bucket. What I'm looking for here, and learn what it means, is what he tells the leaders. I want sinners. Fascinating. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, this is undeniable. It's from your magic book, known as the New World Translation, the personally approved version of the Bible by Jesus himself, according to the governing body. And there it is. But let's take a quick note here. I'm not going to go into the massive paradox between the God and Son combo of the Old Testament compared to the God and Son combo of the New Testament. Subject for another day. But I'm going to double down on the message from Jesus in this week's parable. Jesus was never ambiguous. He wasn't mysterious in his messaging or his teachings. He was forthright. But most importantly, he demonstrated deep love and deep mercy to everyone he came in contact with. Undeniable, wouldn't you agree? Before you say, well, what about the Pharisees or the merchants in the temple when he lost his cool and he acted like a Black Friday shopper at a local Walmart? Consider he could have destroyed them all at any time. But no. Just extending the entire thought process around what he is looking for in sinners, he opted instead to come to earth, exit a woman as a human baby, pooped his pants, ate food, grew a beard, and a whole lot more, all in an effort to save people, particularly, as we just read in Matthew 9, sinners. And instead of reminding everyone that he would soon have a publishing company in the 20th century and appoint an all-American cast of Caucasian men, oops, disclaimer, he did add some diversity with Sam Hurd in 1999. And let's face it, a year immortalized by another Jehovah's Witness, Prince himself. No, Jesus instead reminded anyone listening to him that love and mercy should dominate their lives. He reiterates this every step of his ministry in the four Gospels, every conversation, secret or to crowds. A couple of examples. In John 13:35, from the New World Translation, often quoted by the governing body themselves, it says this, quote, "By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves," end quote. But one that always landed home for me from Jesus' mouth, one more time before we kick into the story and parable, comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 through 48, where Jesus himself again says, quote, "However, I say to you, continue to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you." Wow. "So that you may prove yourselves sons of your Father who is in the heavens. For if you love those loving you, what reward do you have? Are not also the tax collectors doing the same thing? And if you greet your brothers only, what extraordinary thing are you doing? Are not also the people of the nations doing the same thing? You must accordingly be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." End quote. For a dub listening, this is from Jesus' mouth. He wasn't reading from a watchtower or a 192-page book or on a stage at a district convention. This, he made clear, was how he felt about treatment of others, particularly sinners, even those who might be hurting us. Pretty powerful. So keep a couple of these small reminders on love and mercy, again, all from Jesus himself, not the governing body, in mind, as we now begin one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. A story that so powerfully illustrates how Jesus himself defines love, but gives every human being with a working brain and a couple brain cells a concrete, easy to understand guideline on how to love, treat, and forgive people unconditionally. A story that even non-Christians point to as a masterpiece. A story that completely obliterates legalism, rules, and all kinds of parameters. It lays waste to the idea of judicial committees and disfellowshipping, private reproof, and favors things like nuance, compassion, mercy, love. A story that, in my opinion, singularly, makes the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses look either completely lost or openly defiant of the king they claim picked them. So now, after that long opening set of remarks, I present to you story time with the king, the Prodigal Son. I'm sure you saw it coming. First, let's get this out of the way. The governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses live in a world of delusion. I am not of the same line of thought that they're just dumb and don't know what they're doing. It's nearly impossible. I don't want to go into the depth of cognitive dissonance for some of those guys being around, quote unquote, the truth their entire lives. But you can't read stories like this or comments like I just read from Jesus himself and be dumb. In fact, if you would like proof in reference to the Prodigal Son and the governing body, the Blind Nine, thank you for that suggestion on YouTube, the Blind Nine in New York, I present to you how they apply the story of the Prodigal Son. I know you're very surprised, right? In the beautiful, mean green book, for some of us, from 1984, known as Survival into a New Earth, Jesus, or so we are supposed to believe, told the guys in New York what this little parable was about. And they repeated the insanity in the Watchtower of 1989, February 15th. But here's a snippet, and we'll get into the story, I promise. They want Jehovah's Witnesses to believe that this story, so simple a 5-year-old can understand, is really about them. I know that shocks you. It says this in Survival into a New Earth book in 1984, quote, "In this illustration, the elder son, the firstborn, appropriately corresponds to the congregation of the firstborn who have been enrolled in the heavens." What? What about the younger son? He must represent a group other than the little flock who have the heavenly hope. Not all of the Lord's, still quoting, not all of the Lord's other sheep fit the description of the younger son, but some do. Even before the ingathering of the other sheep became especially noteworthy, starting in 1935, there's that magic date again, see past episodes, quote, "There were persons who knew that Jehovah is the only true God. But in 1935, when Jehovah's servants first clearly understood the identity of the great crowd, many who correspond to the younger son wholeheartedly offered themselves for service in their father's house." End quote. Okay. This could be an entire episode on insanity. But before we launch into the story and its main characters, and I promise we're getting there, thanks for bearing with me, they want Jehovah's Witnesses to believe that this story told by Jesus way back when was about them. Those guys going to heaven, and the folks that came after 1935 who only could go to earth. I desperately want to dive into the current governing body and how many of them weren't even alive in 1935 but are now king priests. I'm going to resist. In one paragraph, you see what a common Jehovah's Witness, including children sitting in the audience, are told is truth. For those of us that grew up in the type, anti-type era, where comments like this were preceded with words like evidently or obviously, this should truly make you laugh. Okay, it's time. As we read the story now, imagine the mental gymnastics it takes to apply such bullshit to one of the world's most famous parables. That you're in the crowd as Jesus answers the questions and tells the following story, and it all is apparently pointing to a publishing company in the United States in a place known as New York that has not yet been discovered yet as Jesus tells the story. All the while, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses completely misses the point, or should we discern that they are defiantly missing the point of the entire parable? As we shall see, stemming from questions from people just like them, the ones asking Jesus, and how he answers in this parable. Okay, as we did with the Good Samaritan, I'm encouraging thought on how this story should impact a Jehovah's Witness. You likely know the story, but let's break it down in light of the governing body and Jehovah's Witnesses in 2023. The Prodigal Son is a story about redemption and love, unconditional love. It's a masterful story about human nature. I'm going to do it again. Read the story right from the Bible, the New World Translation, as approved by Jesus himself, the guy who told the original story, and let's break down what Jesus has to say. Remember, he is King of Jehovah's Witnesses in 2023, and he is the guy directing the Blind Nine in upstate New York, and let's see what we can learn. I'll tell you, as you crack open your Bible or just listen in, Luke 15 is some kind of chapter. The King of Jehovah's Witnesses has a lot to say to and about leadership. For context, Jesus is confronted by guys in authority in a crowd, including the Pharisees and the scribes, the appointed leaders of his people. Does that sound familiar? And they want to know how to treat sinners. By the way, as this story begins, they're openly disgusted with Jesus that he is eating with sinners and not shunning them. How fascinating. He gives a couple of other illustrations. They don't grasp them. So Jesus drops an emotional bombshell on them. And an observation I made early as a Jehovah's Witness, Jesus often used inanimate objects in his illustrations. But he doesn't do that here. No seeds, no buildings, no nothing. On this issue about how to treat each other, and particularly those that have committed big-time sin, he goes straight for emotional damage with the crowd. He goes intimate to get the point across and to land it home. He goes with a father or a daddy and his son, his kid. And I personally don't think that's an accident. Side point, that's only maybe interesting to me. There's an almost identical story in Buddhism. Interesting. Subject for another episode. Nonetheless, Jesus goes for the heart. And remember, the leaders, the people he expected to be teaching, comforting, and taking care of sinners in all way, shape, and form, are disgusted by him because he's not shunning sinners. You can see where this is going. How does Jesus answer the crowd? At Luke chapter 15 and verse 11, the story of the prodigal son begins. And it says there simply, quote, "Then he said, a man had 2 sons. Just my own side note. What is it with 2 sons in stories in the Bible? We got Cain and Abel. We got Jacob and Esau. We got Ephraim and Manasseh. We got Eli's bad sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Heck, we even got Jesus and Satan. Seems to be a theme. Jehovah likes this one a lot, apparently, because it couldn't have been written by men, right? No, don't forget that. Dismiss that. Okay, back to the story. But one very important point to take note of as the story begins, this father is a dedicated Jew. Dedicated. And so are his sons. They're born in as Jewish followers. They are dedicated at birth. Sort of like being a baptized Jehovah's Witness today. Do not forget that point as this story progresses. They are dedicated members of Jehovah's current nation. Back to the story. Quote, in Luke 15, "And the younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that should come to me.'" End quote. Okay. Listen, this is where the pain begins. We got ourselves a bad kid, a rebellious son. In Watchtower literature, he's an older son. He's got a beard. He's well past the bloom of youth, and he is apparently still single, but he goes to his father, and he wants his inheritance. And context is everything as we get to know the younger son in this parable, to understand the gravity of what he was actually doing to his father, to his family, and also to his faith, his spiritual standing as a Jew. So I ask you to pretend you're in the audience there as the King of Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus himself, shares this story. The baby of the family was acting up. He's committing not just a simple request here in Luke 15, he's committing a massive, disrespectful sin against his family. He isn't just asking for money. He is embarrassing and dishonoring his entire family, but especially his father. His birthright is to carry on, as a Jew, his birthright is to carry on the family name. You don't get your inheritance while your father is still alive, if you're a Jew. You get it when he dies. So this young guy, the youngest son in this parable, is essentially telling his father, "I wish you were dead. Give me my money now." Wow. Oh my. In the Jewish culture, the audience that Jesus is speaking to and teaching us by extension in 2023, this young kid was stealing his father's money, and not only his father's, but future generations of his family. This would have been highly disgusting, highly disrespectful to all of those listening to Jesus' parable in the audience. We might even say this young kid, the youngest son, was the ultimate sinner. This would have been insulting on a level we can't even wrap our minds around. Despite this being seen as a horrendous sin, and obviously Jesus knew what he was doing in this parable, it didn't involve anything sexual, just a side point. Because among Jehovah's Witnesses today, this had to be a sexual sin, right? No, this was worse. This was worse, particularly to the audience. So Jesus' point was not lost. They asked him, what are you doing hanging around with sinners? And why aren't you shunning them? And he says, let me tell you a third story in this chapter, because they couldn't wrap their head around it. And by comparison, as you consider what this young son was doing to his father and his family, apparently this isn't anywhere near as serious as a Jehovah's Witness today telling their parents that they just no longer want to be a Jehovah's Witness. No sin, don't want any money, don't want to defame the family, don't want anything else. I just don't think I want to be a Jehovah's Witness anymore. I don't agree with it. Most Jehovah's Witnesses today have to tell their parents that they want to leave. But we certainly do not wish our parents to be dead or want to get at their bank account. But as we will come to see by the end, by a Jehovah's Witness just leaving this organization in 2023, a Jehovah's Witness guarantees treatment this kid never gets. And there's the lesson, folks. Just by leaving, he's going to be treated horrifically. It's apparently next level. The irony here is that most Jehovah's Witnesses desperately want to keep their parents in family in every single way today, but can't under current Jehovah's Witness rules. Also, as you will come to see, not discussed in this parable by Jesus himself, which raises a whole series of questions regarding what the hell the governing body is doing in the worldwide congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll get to that, but okay, the stage is set. Back to the story. Quote, so he divided his belongings between them, end quote. This is the father with his two sons. Wow. As you read this story, and again, please be standing in the audience, go along the journey with me. Zero fight from the dad, nothing. He simply divides the family assets between the older son, who didn't even ask, and the rebellious younger son, who's being a real pain in the ass. You'll note that missing in this story of a grotesquely disrespectful act and sin that will affect his family and everyone watching on, missing in this story is a visit from the elders to, talk some sense into him, or maybe a warm, fuzzy shepherding call. No, it's not there from Jesus. No word on discipline at all. Not even a good local needs talk to mark him. Nothing. Jesus, in telling the story, says that the dad just looks at him and says, okay. And even more interesting to me, Jesus never mentions calling the older men at all to talk some sense into him. Not at all. It's all handled within the family by the father. Sounds like respect to me, huh? Also note, the older brother got his inheritance too, but we don't hear much from him yet, but we'll get to him later. Okay. Simple side notes in this parable. Back to the story, quote, a few days later, the younger son gathered all his things together and traveled to a distant country and squandered his property by living a debauched life, end quote. Oh yeah, now here's the part of the story that a Jehovah's Witness who sat in any kingdom hall for any amount of time and has heard from the stage can relate to. Wait a minute. He not only disrespects the family and wants everything now, but he leaves. Oh, okay. And of course, when he leaves, he goes off the rails. Jesus is setting the tone here. Again, the kid is going off the rails. That is what every sinner does. Even today, when a Jehovah's Witness leaves the organization or the family, they immediately go nuts. They go crazy. They dive into a world of hookers and blow. Right? You've heard it a million times from a stage or from an elder. Or maybe in this case, Jesus was talking about a Jehovah's Witness who simply wants to go off to college and needed some money. Because, that is what a Jehovah's Witness does when they go away to school. They go off the rails, they waste money on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what the governing body tells us, Jesus, today. But the truth is that Jesus wasn't talking about either. It's right there. He was showing that someone can get into really, really bad stuff, make some bad decisions, including leaving your family, dare I say the organization. However, the governing body applies it differently because it suits their narrative in 2023. In fact, would it surprise you to know they build entire Watchtower experience articles around stuff like this, around what the son was doing in the parable of the prodigal son? That he left where he lived, he took what funds he had, and he went off to party. The Watchtower today is filled with stories like this for Jehovah's Witnesses to read and apply and figure out in their own lives. And I wanted to share one example. One example is a guy, I guess we would call him Brother Brian Hewitt, from the Watchtower of 2013, January 1st, pages 10 through 11, under a series I must have missed because I was then out of the organization, a series called The Bible Changes Lives series. Not kidding. Where online you'll find what looks like almost like a poor man's dating profile. And it literally, if you go find this on the website now, I was baffled by this. It literally reads like this. It has a picture of him when he's out with long hair and being a partier with the following subsets: year born, 1981, country of origin, United States, history, prodigal son. I know what they're trying to do here, but it looks like a dating profile, and he's being labeled as the prodigal son. In the story, he goes on to relate that it all started with a cigarette. Of course, the cigarette led to sex, drug dealing, all kinds of other activity. But you guessed it. It was a district convention in the year 2000 that made Brother Brian Hewitt change his ways and go on to become a baptized, full-time pioneer. The governing body churns out pages and pages of similar stories. There's lots of them. The format was all new to me and very weird, but they turn out these stories with, of course, a whole bunch of details missing, such as the key point here. In this one experience, I have to call it out, where Brother Brian Hewitt, upon sharing his story, you begin to learn real simple stuff that impacted him in a different way than most Jehovah's Witnesses. The key point being that he was never baptized. So he could go off, go bonkers, go have a life of parties, wine, women, and song, and then he could come back to the organization with no repercussions. So immediately, in the story and the parable of the prodigal son that they say he is in this article, they've missed a key point. The younger son in the prodigal son is a dedicated Jew. He is up for the worst kind of punishment. He was born in, dedicated. Brian Hewitt, in the modern-day world of Jehovah's Witnesses, is never baptized. So he could go off and party. He could steer clear of a judicial committee. And most importantly, his parents could and would continue to speak to him the entire time he was living it up. based on something I've covered in the past on a parenting episode of the show, a bizarre cultural Jehovah's Witness loophole where parents continue to associate with kids that have openly rejected Jehovah and his 9 guys in New York. They don't want anything to do with them. And they continue to hang out with them, all because they never got in a pool at the circuit assembly. Suddenly, that rejection of God and his organization doesn't matter. They never got wet. But the governing body takes an experience like this, takes Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, and somehow says it's apples to apples when it isn't. And any Jehovah's Witness would know this. Oddly, this is never touched on by the governing body. Nope. Brother Hewitt, in this one example I'm sharing amidst the parable, he goes nuts. He gets to keep his family. Then, and only after he answered those 2 life-altering baptism questions that locked him into a publishing company for life, does it even matter. If you would like to see a recent example of this bizarre loophole that does not in any way correspond to the prodigal son, I present to you Serena Williams. Serena Williams, the world champion tennis player, multimillionaire, fashionista, and oftentimes supporter of all kinds of political issues, runs off as the I can't say prodigal son or daughter. She runs off and leaves her raising her life as a Jehovah's Witness to become a multi-million-dollar athlete, fashionista, and more. But as she calms down, by the way, the entire time her family benefits, not only from her association and the familial relationship, but also probably from her money, let's call it what it is. But then as she calms down, as she ages, just months ago, world-famous Serena Williams gets into a pool and voila, everything is okay. Meanwhile, during the entire time she was rejecting Jehovah and his organization, although raised as a Jehovah's Witness, Mom keeps hanging out with her because none of it mattered. All based on a strange loophole that the governing body tries to say Brian Hewitt benefited from him too, because he was the prodigal son, just like Jesus' parable, only, folks, he was not. They weren't baptized, and the prodigal son, during the Jewish culture, at the time Jesus uttered these inspiring words, was a dedicated Jew. The little Jehovah's Witness cultural detail loophole flies in the face of everything Jesus is teaching here. The younger Jewish son was a dedicated Jew by birth. He didn't get this benefit. But by governing body standards, looking at the story of the prodigal son, he is apostatized, left home to party. So he was detestable by their standards, meaning that he was doomed to death. We will see how and why this is important in 2023, especially in how this rebellious son was treated upon his return. But back to the story. Doubling down on the wise counsel of the guys in charge, they say the following about this father-son relationship. And this is just all levels of insane. From the Awake of 1986, February 22nd, pages 8 through 11, under the article, Why Does God Allow Suffering? It says this, quote, perhaps we can compare God's way of dealing with wayward humankind to the prodigal or wasteful son in one of Jesus' parables. Jesus told of a man with 2 sons, the younger of which demanded his share of the inheritance while his father was still alive. He wanted to be independent, to leave home, and to prove he could make it alone. The father could have taken swift action by refusing the son's request and by locking him up in a room so that he could not escape. Would that have served any lasting purpose? No, because the son would have then stayed against his will, Furthermore, it would have denied him the exercise of his free will. So what did the father do? The father had not taken drastic action, but had allowed for the son to see the folly of his ways. End quote. And so another interesting factor. Do they even read their own stuff? I mean, what? Apparently they love exposing their own gross hypocrisy when comparing their actions today to Jehovah's actions throughout time. Those most brilliant men in all the earth, chosen by Jesus himself, apparently can't see that they, quote, lock people up in a room called disfellowshipping, forcing many people to, stay against their will, in their case, just to keep family and friends, stripping them of their free will and forcing them to continue to be a Jehovah's Witness. In the time I've left, it's spawned such amazing acronyms that it took me time to learn, like PME, POMO, PIMO, all sorts of things where people are living under the radar, faking it, locked in a room so they can keep their family. But pay no attention to this level of incompetence. This is all in line with the spirit of Jesus' story, right? Wrong. Back to the story. I apologize for the divergence. I digress. The story then says this: as the boy has left, took everything with him, and started living a debauched life. Quote, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred throughout that country, and he fell into need. End quote. Okay. So again, remember the audience. Remember what Jesus is answering. As the story continues, Jesus wants to highlight that the younger son is making bad choices, bad decisions. Today, the governing body loves to take such stories and promote the idea, the famine, of course, they'll highlight that, natural disasters, or just all kinds of bad things and outcomes are all somehow tied to the younger son's decisions. Not what Jesus meant or said, but they do it all the time. They'll literally go and stretch themselves and do mental gymnastics to say that they made a bad decision, therefore a hurricane happened. Natural disasters occur. Or bad things are just going to happen. They'll stretch themselves on that writing committee. When you leave Jehovah's organization, disasters always happen. In fact, you'll go broke. Don't think Jesus ever meant that, but you hear it often in the talks at the conventions. But this kid leaves, falls on hard times, and loses everything. Bad decisions. On second thought, maybe this is, as I look at this now, my brain fires, and maybe this is where the governing body does a little bit of their Christianity a la carte with this story and lifts this detail to push on Jehovah's Witnesses that says, you leave this organization, you're going to go broke, you're going to lose everything. But just like the Good Samaritan of last week, it's not remotely the moral of the story. It's a detail. The entire point here by Jesus is this: he is making bad choices and he is sinning. The people in the audience that he said this to in Luke 15 would understand this. This young son is sinning as seriously as humanly possible at that time, including disloyalty to his family and his faith. It's the ultimate insult to a Jew in that audience. He took money, he disrespected, he disappeared. So let's see what this means for him as Jesus continues the lesson. Quote from Jesus, he even went and attached himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to herd swine. And he longed to be filled with the carob pods that the swine were eating, but no one would give him anything. End quote. Things aren't going well for the son gone bad. People won't even give him pig food, and he's hungry. It's at this point in my own application of this story on this crazy show, I want to point out that a clueless elder on a shepherding call might try to apply this part of the story to things Jesus wasn't remotely discussing or teaching. You guessed it, bad association. He's left the family and he's now hanging out with people that aren't like us or his family, minimizing the fact that an equally skeptical foreigner actually hired an outsider. But when considered in context of the audience, it actually gets a whole lot more serious than just bad association, as some very uneducated elder would likely push in this story. It gets worse. Remember, the audience who started this conversation were leaders. They were the leaders of the Jews, the leading groups, the leading factions, people that should have known better. The Pharisees, the scribes, it even goes into secular folks with tax collectors. The guys Jesus should have arrived on earth to find leading his people in all things Jehovah. The Pharisees, the scribes, the tax collectors, and even sinners were in the crowd that he was talking to. So let that sink in. Those taking the lead, those charged with teaching and administering discipline to the Jews, Jesus' people, would have been shocked by this part of the story. It gave details that showed how down and dirty the place was that this kid had gotten himself into. Jews did not eat pork because pigs were declared unclean by the Mosaic law. The Pharisees and the scribes would, of course, be shocked to hear all of this. As a result, the average Jew would want nothing to do with pigs, much less hurting them. But here was the young son associating with them by actually taking care of them. By the way, no small thing that incidentally scientists estimate that 85% of adult pigs have parasites. Bacon. But Jews, particularly the Jews in the audience Jesus is telling this story to, would have been horrified. They would not go near a pig. They wouldn't touch a pig. In fact, in places in Leviticus, it talks about just touching the skin of a pig is a sin. Ah, yes, entire Bible verses on this in the Bible, the magic book, for those that are interested. But in fairness, the young son here didn't eat the pigs or, cook a pig and eat some bacon. He just wanted to eat the food they were eating, their slop, pig slop. Clearly not his best day after leaving his father and family. He was in the pits of despair. He was in a really nasty, gross, dark place. And again, you're in the audience, and the leaders are listening to this, and they're horrified. The sinners are horrified, but also can possibly relate, because maybe they're there. But Jesus' point to those listening, those taking the lead, was this. In the eyes of a Jew, again, especially the Pharisees and scribes, the son would have become the most defiled human being imaginable. He would have been considered detestable. Sound familiar? Unclean in every way. He had destroyed his relationship with his God, his people, and his own family. There was no hope for redemption in the mind of those leaders, those taking the lead that were listening to the story. He was cooked. It was over for him. Sound familiar? They would have viewed this young son the same way as, and it ain't a stretch, folks, a Jehovah's Witness views an apostate or someone who has left the organization today. Very, very, very simple to see. The story continues, quote, "When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, while I am dying here from hunger? I will get up and travel to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. End quote. You can likely, if you're anything like me, you can picture the emotion as Jesus is saying this to this crowd. Wow. Let's collect our thoughts here for a second. The young son in this story, he wishes his father was dead. He takes all of the assets he can, impacting future generations of his family. He parties hard, blowing all of his money, and ends up basically homeless and starving. That is what happens to a Jehovah's Witness that leaves the organization too, according to the governing body. Not true. And is forced to return to his father, and is willing to humble himself and work quietly as an employee. In other words, simply stated, Jesus is teaching that he is apologizing for his bad decisions, and he's willing to make reasonable amends to show he's sorry. Reasonable amends. I'll work for it. I always thought it was interesting that Jesus pointed out the gravity of his bad decisions. Not only did he disrespect his parents, but he mentioned sinning against heaven or Jehovah. Remember, he's a dedicated Jew, baptized Jehovah's Witness. So he has done the worst of the worst a human being or a Jew could do in this story. But he is asking for mercy. Much worse than disagreeing with 9 guys in New York. Much worse than smoking a cigarette. Much worse than feeling up a girl. Much worse than going to college or having sex with someone you're not married to. Thank you for that little, often overlooked detail, Jesus. You made sure it was in your book. It's so simply stated. I don't have to be a rocket scientist to pick up on it. But here's the thing. I think the guys you chose in Wallkill, New York, have missed the point. And that leads to a whole bunch of questions from ex and current Jehovah's Witnesses. But back to the story. Quote, so he got up and he went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was moved with pity, and he ran and embraced him and tenderly kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quick, bring out a robe, the best one, and clothe him with it, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Also bring the fattened calf, slaughter it, and let us eat and celebrate. For his son of mine was dead, but has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they started to enjoy themselves. End quote. By Jesus. So these verses are clearly a misprint, right? If you're a Jehovah's Witness listening and you haven't thought about this story before in this light, you're probably feeling weird, a little uncomfortable, or questions are popping in your head. If you're one under the radar who's thought about this a million times, you're nodding your head. This all has to be a misprint by Jesus, right? Was he getting the thumbs down on the theocratic school that night? Pay no attention to this. Here is the point of Jesus' story. And listen, apparently, according to the governing body, we're supposed to believe Jesus has some memory issues. We've established this many times. Somewhere between keeping the earth on its axis, the sun shining on our planet, coming to earth to die for every single man, woman, and child, and also running a publishing company in New York, Jesus forgot some details that only 9 guys in New York apparently can handle. He left out a few things on how to treat someone who was truly sorry for making mistakes. I want to look at some of those details he left out in the verses we just read. Let's summarize. The bad kid heads home. His father sees him from a distance. Almost like he might be actively looking for the child, the young man. Jesus says here he's so moved with love and excitement that he runs out to him. He hugs him. He kisses him. And wouldn't we all? The father is undoubtedly elderly. No details on slipping on a pair of Nikes or Nike sandals. He simply sees him and reacts. But here's the detail Jesus apparently left out that the governing body includes. Thank God they're here to help us. The father, by the modern day standards of Jehovah's Witnesses, isn't even supposed to speak to his son. He's supposed to shun him as someone detestable. So apparently, missing from the story, the father must, right, call the elders in the local congregation and ask them to form a judicial committee. His bad kid is heading up the sidewalk. It's not there. But it's here today in Jehovah's Witnesses. But our continuing summarization here, in this parable from the guy we are told put Jehovah's Witnesses together, including the entire judicial process and disfellowshipping and private reproofs and marking talks and all this other stuff, shares something the governing body just apparently doesn't understand. The father, my God, I can't emphasize this enough. In terms of timing, the father welcomes the sinning son back immediately. Wait, what? Wait a second. The son doesn't have to sit in the back of the kingdom hall for a while? And I'll tell you, every ex-elder knows this ain't happening. In fact, it's at this point in a sinner's journey to return, to be reinstated, that elders dig deep into something I call the imaginary tear of repentance, the tears of repentance. Every ex-elder knows what I speak of. Any judicial committee hearing a disfellowship person's plea for reinstatement also requires them to write a letter that is never mentioned by Jesus in this parable, operating off some bizarre set of standards Jesus doesn't mention in this parable. I used to call it the sin chart that tells an elder or a group of elders just how long it will be before we're going to let the sinner back in the congregation. That's right. Unseen in this parable, this loving, incredibly emotional story Jesus is telling leaders he expects to know. 3 guys today among Jehovah's Witnesses take an appointment with a person begging to come back. They then dismiss them. They then discuss among the 3 of them some timetable, the sin chart, that doesn't exist anywhere, including in this story, and then they make a person wait. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years. Years. I was involved in cases where the other 2 guys on the committee flat out told someone begging to be back in the congregation that it would be at least a year due to how notorious their sins were. Due to some secret tiers of sin, the sin chart, where you get to say cigarette is 3 months, adultery is a year, all completely fabricated, or at least not mentioned in this story by Jesus. You'll note, the father just saw the son from far away and ran to him. There was no elders. There was no timetable. There was no secret cultural sin chart. He immediately ran out to him and hugged him, kissed him, and held him. Can Jehovah's Witnesses not read? Sorry if that sounds harsh. But how anyone misses this detail in one of Jesus' most famous stories is a stunner. As we summarize, Jesus may have been overly excited the day of his parable and in answering the leaders of his day. Why? Because when a sinner returns to Jehovah's Witnesses today, there ain't a lot of hugging and kissing going on. And instead of running out to embrace someone who wants to return, they, wait for it, shun them and pretend they're dead. That's right. A child showing up on a doorstep, adult child or younger, doesn't matter, who is baptized and removed from the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses is to be treated like they are dead. Their own kids, friends, family, dead. There sure aren't hugs. In fact, we all remember the counsel from the stage, and I had to give it, that by extension shows how nasty someone who's made bad decisions in life, like the young son in the Prodigal Son story, is treated by Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm sure many of you will remember it. Not only are they to be shunned, not only are they to deal with three guys, not only are they to wait it out, sometimes for years, but even when they are reinstated, Jehovah's Witnesses are reminded from the stage, and let me tell you, I was an elder that had to give the local needs talk, that it's inappropriate to even clap for a person following an announcement that they were reinstated. You can't even clap. Jesus is saying the Father sees him. He runs out to him. He hugs him. He embraces him. They're crying. He's kissing him. He gives him food. He dresses him. He gives him jewelry. It's as if someone dead has come back to life. But in Jehovah's Witnesses, just saying so-and-so is back, you can't even clap. And if you've ever seen this in real time, it is bizarre. The announcement is made, and I've made them. There's an odd, uncomfortable silence that just hangs in the air as the poor person who's been sitting in the back of the Kingdom Hall for a year or more just takes on everyone's stare. So if you're keeping track at home, Jesus says in this powerful story, he says to run, hug them, kiss them. The governing body says, sit there, shut your mouths, and be silent. Wow. Are these just reading comprehension issues? How many questions do you have about the guy who discovered Jehovah's Witnesses saying to do the opposite of what Jehovah's Witnesses do? Note, the son confesses. Can we assume three elders were present and left out of the story? Probably not. Also not shared here, the elders take the son or ask the son what he's done, right? Just like in a judicial committee today, well, we got to review every sin you've ever done in great detail. Has he been with a woman? I'm going to get crass here, ladies, for a minute. How many times did he orgasm? Where did he touch her? Were you drinking? How many drinks? What night was it? Who saw you? What were you wearing? Was it sexually suggested? Jesus doesn't mention any of this. But anyone who sat through a judicial committee of Jehovah's Witnesses today knows that's one of the most horrific experiences of your life. And I've said on this show before that I was in far too many committees to remember, but I can tell you about a couple that I shut down, asked the poor sinning person to leave so I could tear into the other two guys who seemed to have some of the most perverse questions and need for details I've ever seen in my life. Jesus doesn't mention it here, folks. The son comes up the walk. The father sees him. It's hug and kiss time. Welcome back. Jesus simply stated to the leaders of his time, apparently not the leaders of our time, that you are to embrace them, love them, honor them, have a party. But what about Dad? And of course, the unmentioned elders in this story. But Dad, he doesn't stop there. He gives them new clothes, he gives them good food, and likens the entire situation to getting someone back from the dead. Jesus threw in there that they started to enjoy themselves. That's how the story ends. It ends with, they started to enjoy themselves. Wow. This little 5-6 words rocked my world as an elder. The hours spent with reinstated Jehovah's Witnesses, some of whom were in my own family, who were still, after being reinstated, going through the awful meeting, not in this story, going through the awful insinuations, not in this story, they still, after being reinstated, were still being silently shunned in their congregation. Never really accepted back into the fold. They still had no friends. Even some of their family kept treating them weird. Jesus says throw a party, hug each other, enjoy yourselves. The governing body says, I don't think so. If you have ever been disfellowshipped and reinstated and listening to this podcast, thanks. It's a long one. But do you know what I mean? Fact. This doesn't always happen in Jehovah's Witnesses today. Many people who come back read this parable by Jesus in a much different way than the rest of us. They live a life where they continue to wear a shirt with a stain on it for all to see. In fact, if you're a brother in Jehovah's Witnesses today, have been DF'd or left and have worked your way back, you can't even handle the microphones because that's a privilege. And sure, no way in hell are you going to be an elder, a servant, or a pioneer. There's even made up years for how long the elder body can consider you to be a servant after you've been reinstated. And those years have changed. Used to be 2, used to be 3, I've heard 7. But it takes years because, well, that time you left and did bad things, we're going to keep reminding you. We still remember. And it's odd because none of that sounds like the party thrown for the bad son that Jesus describes in the Prodigal Son parable. Who does it sound like, actually? Let's go back to the story. To wind this long episode up, quote Luke 15, as the story continues, remember they're out having a good time, and Jesus blessed that. Now enters someone else. Quote, now his older son was in the field, and as he returned and got near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants to him and asked what was happening. He said to him, your brother has come, and your father slaughtered the fattened calf because he got him back in good health. Interesting to know this fattened calf thing. Must have been sitting around getting fat for a long time for a special occasion. Son shows up, special occasion. Back to the story, quote, but the older boy here, he became angry and he refused to go in. Then his father came out and began to plead with him. In reply, he said to his father, look, these many years I have slaved for you, and never once did I disobey your orders, and yet you never once gave me a young goat to enjoy with my friends. Wow. But as soon as this son of yours, notice he doesn't call him his brother? Interesting, huh? This son of yours arrived who squandered your belongings with prostitutes. You slaughtered the fattened calf for him. Then he said to him, my son, you have always been with me, and all the things that are mine are yours. But we just had to celebrate and rejoice, for your brother was dead, but has come to life. He was lost, and he was been found. Okay. I think we recognize this guy, huh? The older son. The older son is prominent, and you can pick him out in the congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll do one of their fun things from the past. We'll call him Brother Resentment. Or is it Sister Bitter? Either way, we all know them. Someone went off and partied it up. They took all the family's money and tossed it around on hookers and blow. They're back. Dad brings out the best bottle of wine, in this case a fattened calf. he's instantaneously reinstated into the family or returns to the congregation. And no way in hell is the older son in this parable going to let it go. But to take it a step further, the older son and everyone just like him in modern day congregations take their cue from the guys in New York. Jehovah's Witnesses in most cases would never consider throwing a party with music and dancing, as Jesus mentions in this story, with the best food and wine, none of that, for a newly reinstated brother or sister. This should make every current Jehovah's Witness listening, as well as those of us that are former JWs, just laugh out loud. Imagine throwing or attending a party for someone just reinstated. We wouldn't conceive of it. It bled into us as well. Like the older brother in this parable, many Jehovah's Witnesses are angry and refuse to go in. In other words, refuse to associate again, embrace them, forget about the past. They refuse. They refuse to join the party, as the king here says. And remember, he's telling this entire story to the Pharisees and the scribes. And the governing body doesn't seem to make the connection. They literally fly in the face of the parable of the prodigal son. And as a more, just to land it home, as a more recent example on how they treat people, take a look at the Toni Morris saga. One day you're a king on the governing body, the one day you're not. No one's talking about you. We can't get a word out. Still no word on what's going on with the demoted king. But equally of note, no story of a party, a new suit, some good food and wine. Sorry, Tony, I should have made that scotch. You're a scotch guy. Or anything else. And this is a guy that was one of them. No party. No embracing. Most Jehovah's Witnesses are the older son. Certainly leadership is. They're upset. They're angry that this son immediately gets brought right back into the family. He gets some nice things. He gets the fat calf. I couldn't even get a goat. Lot to unpack there. For that Jehovah's Witness that makes some bad decisions, says they're sorry, and crawls back to a windowless kingdom hall, I can assure you no one throws a party. And most of the other publishers, the other witnesses, react just like the older brother. Some are angry, don't feel like they got enough punishment, didn't have enough time out, were reinstated too quickly, and continue, in many cases, to at most just be polite as the years go by. But run over for a hug, a kiss, a party? Come on. Anyone listening that was one of Jehovah's Witnesses knows that's absurd. And yet, I want to remind you, this is a story from Jesus on how to treat, love, and be merciful to others. But taking the older brother's reaction in mind and really looking at how they react to this, it all leads back to a group we know well, the governing body. Is it any wonder they try to apply this to some fabricated teaching about heavenly people versus paradise people, as I noted at the beginning of this long episode, when in fact the entire parable is answering guys just like them and showing them how to treat a sinner, or literally anyone for that matter, from the guy they claim whispers in their ear from heaven. Seems pretty straightforward. And there you have it. Behold, cognitive dissonance for millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. Some may start to think about this, immediately shut it down in their head. I did that. And for most, start thinking about where they're going for food after the meeting. You will literally hear this parable, and if you start to let your mind go there, you start getting what witnesses call doubts. So they dismiss it. Otherwise, they have to face the brutal fact that the governing body and Jehovah's Witnesses as a religion completely and thoroughly disobey and ignore the point of Jesus' story of the prodigal son. The main purpose of this parable is Jesus rebuking legalism, rules, rigidity. And this is frankly why I love this story. Jesus, whether you believe in him or not, Jesus of the Gospels puts on full display for the universe that he isn't a rules guy. He's not a rules guy. It doesn't matter how well someone obeyed the law, what their motive was, the mercy. It doesn't matter, because love and mercy are more important to Jesus than anything else. He taught this on earth, and he's teaching it to men he expects to lead. It should be love for Jesus of the Bible that motivates a Christian to obedience. Certainly not the bizarre, nowhere to be found in this story rules of a publishing company in New York. It's straight up insulting intellectually. So as I wrap this really long episode up, I apologize. This story deserves probably 2 hours. Hopefully you gleaned something. But for a thinking person who has read the Prodigal Son in Luke chapter 15, really only questions remain. Questions whether you're a Jehovah's Witness or not, an apologist, whatever it might be, that you will need to fight through years of conditioning to answer. Questions like, what changed with Jesus? This story is so wonderful. It's a masterpiece, even for non-Christians, and yet we're to believe he chose guys in 1919 that completely say the opposite of this story and act like the guys he was telling the story to? Questions like, should I just take the word of the guys in upstate New York? Or has there been some kind of new light that they haven't shared with us regarding the story of the prodigal son? But most importantly, when I read this story, this masterpiece, how should the story of the prodigal son impact me, whether I'm a Christian or not, whether I'm a Jehovah's Witness or not? And frankly, what action should I take? How should I apply it? After that long diatribe, I appreciate you staying. Those are questions that only we as individuals can answer. The story of the prodigal son, covered here under Story Time with the King, is a masterpiece. And in no way, shape, or form does the governing body apply it. So whatever your questions are, I hope you'll give it a few minutes and really consider what the answer is. I want to thank you for sticking around with me this week. This might be the longest episode ever of Surviving Paradise, and I appreciate you being interested in listening. Wherever you may be, thanks again for being here, and until we see you next week, be well.